So today we begin the third lecture of the Vatican II lecture series on Lumen, Gentium, the dogmatic constitution of the Church. And so today, just like initially what we looked at the big idea in lecture number 1, that we need to receive Jesus in order to give Jesus away, and that we are part of the one priesthood of Christ, each in our own way. The priests in their way, the laity in their way, so that the priest consecrate what the laity offers, right? The priest cannot consecrate what the laity does not offer, right? So that's what we did in lecture number 1. In lecture number 2, we looked at the universal call to holiness, and we looked at it specifically through the lens of married life, the sacramentally married life, and how powerful that is, that this particular image of holiness is making visible the groom, Jesus, and his bride, the church. And in the mercy with which the groom and the bride interact with each other, husband and wife interact with each other with grace, and with their children, should they be given children, should they accept children from the Lord, at that moment there would be an image of God that would be unique, and a particular form of holiness that is absolutely essential for the people of God to see God in this nuptial, covenantal marriage relationship that he has with us. Today we're going to see the complementary side of that in lecture number 3. We're going to see how the universal call to holiness in the church is now imaged in consecrated celibacy, and how, just as it was necessary for us to see the image of the holiness in married life, and that without it we would be missing clearly the union of Jesus and his church. Today we are going to look in how in consecrated celibacy we see an icon of the fulfillment, our ultimate fulfillment in heaven, anticipated on earth. In other words, and I'm going to quote Lumen Gentium here, therefore all the faithful of Christ, this is paragraph 42, therefore all the faithful of Christ are invited to strive for the holiness and perfection of their own proper state. So that's a bit of a recap there. Indeed, they have an obligation to so strive for the holiness and perfection of their own proper state. So you're a member of the clergy, you strive for the holiness and perfection proper to your vocation in life. Whether it's the life of a consecrated celibate, the life of a married man or woman, right? So that it's your obligation to strive for the holiness and perfection of your own state. And so you can't strive for the point here is that you can't strive for the holiness and perfection of what is not yours. You can't try to be holy as a priest if you're not a priest. You can't try to be holy as a married woman if you're not a married woman, right? So that's not going to happen. So let them have care, the faithful of Christ, that they guide aright their own deepest sentiments of soul. Guide aright. So in other words, you could mislead yourself by wanting a holiness that is not proper to you. Maybe envying the holiness of another. Or it'd be easier for us, if I had that kind of life, then I'd be really holy. That's a lie. That's not true, right? Let neither, and then the point that I want to make about consecrated celibacy is right there in that moment. So pay attention. Let neither the use of the things of this world, nor attachment to riches, which is against the spirit of evangelical poverty, hinder the faithful of Christ in their quest for perfect love. So we are being stretched toward that perfect love. It's a quest, right? By definition, a quest is something that you're stretched towards, right? You can't possibly have a quest that is like you get it on day one. That's not a quest. That's not much of a quest, right? So then neither the use of the things of this world, nor attachment to riches, which is against the spirit of evangelical poverty. What's against the spirit of evangelical poverty? Attachment to riches, or the use of the things of this world as if this world was it, using it as if it was an end in of itself. So let's not the things of this world, nor the riches of this world, hinder the faithful of Christ in the quest for perfect love. And who's going to image that for you? Who's going to help you see that? Those who are basically living the calling of an assumed and integrated consecrated celibacy. Because they are living as if this world is passing away, because it is, right? So they've been given the calling, not because they're better than you, but because they are called to that vocation so that they themselves can find their path to holiness by not attaching themselves to this world, but so that the married in this world can look upon what happens in their married life that is, let's just say, not paradise on earth, right? And say, well, I guess it's true. It's true. I shouldn't be surprised by that, right? When I see father, when I see sister, when I see, this nun, this monk, when I see this person that's living a consecrated celibacy as a widow, or consecrated celibacy after a separation by choice, all of a sudden what happens is I find myself capable of not attaching myself to a perfect ideal that has to be lived out every minute of every moment, otherwise I'm not happy, right? This world doesn't have to satisfy me at all times. And then Lumen Gentium continue, let them heed the admonition of the apostle, that would be Paul, Saint Paul, to those who use this world, so that would be the married, right? Let them not come to terms with this world. Let them not settle for this world. Even if they've got RSPs, right? Let them not settle for this world. They're not going to be here forever. Even if they both get to live as husband and wife to a happy old age, and they live when they're 103, let them not come to terms with this world. This is not the final destination. And as the apostle says, for this world, as we see it, is passing away. So St. Paul will say in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7, and as well as verse 31 and 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 31 and 35. It's lovely when you can correct a slide in front of yourself. Those using the world as not using it fully, for the world in its present form is passing away. I should like you to be free of anxieties. I'm telling you this for your own benefit, not to impose a restraint upon you. In other words, not to mandate that everybody is not going to be married. There's no ban on marriage here, right? So, but for the sake of propriety and adherence to the Lord without distraction. So there's something about the consecrated celibate that points the married to say, focus here, right? You can be distracted in this world. You can be worried in this world. You can be anxious in this world. And the consecrated celibate remind you, this world is passing away. Those disciples pursuing poverty, chastity, and obedience, we'll call that the evangelical counsels. Right? So I'll tell you more in a moment, but let's just settle on those three words right now. Poverty, chastity, and obedience. Those are the vows, right? That those who are in consecrated celibacy practice in one way, shape, or form. What is it that they're pursuing in pursuing poverty, chastity, and obedience? They are imitating the poor, chaste, and obedient Jesus. And so this is not random, right? Poverty, chastity, and obedience were not picked as an imitation of, I don't know, some kind of abstract virtue. No, it's an imitation of the poor Jesus, the chaste Jesus, the obedient Jesus. So then the church says, the holiness of the church is fostered in a special way by the observance of the counsels proposed in the gospel by our Lord to his disciples. In other words, he said to them what? Follow me. And then he showed them how to live. And how did he live? He lived as if this world was passing away. And he was a consecrated celibate, right? That is who Jesus is, right? So he did not settle for this world. He was passing through this world, doing good. And in the process, he taught them how to imitate him through those counsels. The word counsel mean here, like when we counsel somebody, it's about how to live, right? So the evangelical counsel is how to live according to the gospel, how to live according to the good news. And who is the good news? Jesus. How to live according to Jesus. So there's a way in which poverty, chastity, and obedience can be lived out through any vocation, but they will be lived in a different way if you're married than if you're a bishop, and if you're a nun, and if you're a monk, and if you're a parish priest. But they can be lived. Right? Those three things, this imitation of Jesus, poor, chaste, and obedient, is going to really be important. And then it says, an eminent position among these observance of the counsels is held. An eminent position among the disciples of Jesus is held by virginity or the celibate state. And so because we say an eminent position, immediately we could be tempted to say, oh, I see. See, you're contradicting yourself. So you're saying it's better. I knew it. I got short change here. No, that's not why it's called eminent. It's eminent because it's despised by the world. It has to be lifted up. Not because it's better than the married state, but because it wouldn't even be on the radar if it wasn't being lifted up. It's being lifted up equal to the married state, not higher. It's lifted equal by the Lord himself, who says, this is a good way to live. This is, in other words, the married state is not the only way to live. And that was something novel. When Jesus walked the earth, there were no monks. There were no monks. I mean, there was like a little group called the Essenes that were living in a cave that were as close as possible that you can get to that. But they were very, very small. And it was not normalized at all. They actually kind of felt to the majority of the Jewish people as if they were sort of like a bit out there, right? So outliers, right? So, but in some ways they were a bit of a foreshadowing of the consecrated celibacy before Jesus actually gave it an imitation of him. So it's not just a matter of not getting married. It's about really imitating Jesus. For a long time, virginity, and it's true now in 2025, virginity is despised by the culture. Think about how many shows, how many movies are basically portraying losing your virginity as something that needs to be done, get it over with. Right? So, as if there's no value there. You know, you're not whole until you have lost it. And so therefore, it's very important for us to realize that what the Lord is saying to us is, so what is the consecrated celibacy? Who is in it? Well, in the first place, the shepherds of Christ's flock. Who would that be? The bishops, right? The bishop must holily, in a holy way, and eagerly, humbly, and courageously. Those four words, right? In a holy way, eagerly, humbly, and courageously carry out their ministry. And how are they receiving their sanctification? In imitation of the eternal high priest. So they are called to imitate Jesus the high priest, right? So, and only they are called specifically to that imitation, to that aspect of Jesus. They're making that aspect of Jesus visible. We read this designation of Jesus in the letter to the Hebrews, right? And the bishops make that visible. And who is the eternal high priest? He's the shepherd and guardian of our souls. So there's a very real way that the bishop is actually the shepherd and guardian of our souls in the name of Christ, within a territory given. And then it says, it reminds them, the council reminds the bishops, they ought to fulfill this duty of imitation of the eternal high priest, shepherd and guardian of our souls in such a way that it will be the principal means also of their own sanctification. In other words, they are not going to be sanctified in the way a monk would be sanctified. They will not become holy in the way that a nun will be sanctified, or a married man or woman will be sanctified. They'll be sanctified in the measure that they imitate in carrying out their ministry, the high priest, shepherd and guardian of our souls. So that they better live up to it, right? Live up to be shepherds, live up to be guardians of our souls, right? So they are entrusted to it. And you can see that the bishop actually in the diocese, if you pay attention, has a big ring, right? So typically it's in his right hand. It's a massive ring, right? So what does that mean? It means that his flock, he is married to his flock, right? So he represents the bridegroom united to his church in a covenant with his church, right? It's very, and he is to live just like a married man would not be, caring for his wife in orbit around the sun, but in a given home, while he is given a territory that he is bound to, that land and the people living on that land. Right? So he has to be anchored, tied down. Right? So it's important for him that he is committed. He's not roaming the planet. Right? So, and then the priests, Lumen Gentium 41, the priests participate in the grace of the bishop's office. So they participate in the bishop's duty, and they should grow daily in their love of God and their neighbor by the exercise of their office. And now you're going to see what they image. If the bishop imaged Jesus, the high priest, they image Jesus, the eternal and unique mediator. Right? So they function as mediation. They mediate the bishop, they mediate Jesus, right? They participate in the ministry of the bishop, so they make the bishop visible in a given parish or given parishes, and they make Jesus visible to those parishioners in their consecrated celibacy. And then it basically exhorts the priests. They should preserve the bond of priestly communion. That means they should act like brothers to each other, right? They really have to foster that sense of fraternity among the priests, not a sense of rivalry, not a sense of envy, not a sense of competition, but a sense of fraternity. And because we're human, and because we're going to struggle against sin, that is going to be purified every time we encounter sin, attacking that priestly communion. So striving for priestly communion when someone is bolting is a lot harder than when everybody's on the same page. But that is the task of the priest. And they should abound in every spiritual good. Or just that. right? Not demanding at all. They should abound in every spiritual good. In other words, they are to go to the source of goodness themselves. They are to go to Jesus because only out of him will the good flow, right? The abundance of good here is it's not that they have to acquire some supernatural power on their own, but that they keep plunging themselves into Jesus in order to deliver Jesus. And if they do that, they will then present to all a living witness to God. So they will stand before God and they will stand before others. They will stand as a living witness to the reality of God in this world. Look at this priest. Heaven must be real, right? Jesus must be alive. Look at him. Look at what's happening in his heart. Look at what's coming out of him. By their very office of praying and offering sacrifice, the priest, that is, for their own people, for their parishioners, and the entire people of God. So the priest is never just offering the Mass for his parishioners. He's offering the Mass for the whole world, right? At every Mass in any given parish church. They, the priests, should rise to greater holiness. So there's the stretching, right? Keeping in mind what they are doing and imitating what they are handling. The council here is quoting a formula that comes at the ordination of a priest. Keeping in mind what they are doing and imitating what they are handling. These priests in their apostolic labors, listen to the following, rather than being ensnared by perils and hardships, should rather rise to greater holiness through these perils and hardships. So it turns out that priests are supposed to go through perils and hardships. Who knew? Right? So, but if they experience and when they experience perils and hardships, they could be ensnared by those perils and hardships. That means they could start complaining about how bad they've got it. Right? So that would be ensnared by it. That would be discouraged by it. Right? So instead, they should rise to greater holiness through these perils and hardship. How? By willpower? No. By ignoring that it's a peril, denying that it's a peril and a hardship? No. By trying to do it all on their own and making sure that no one prays for them because they don't need prayers. We all know that. Right? No. By going to Jesus, who went through peril and hardship. Right? So we're invited in a special way there to understand how the priest is becoming holy. Right? So then it talks about deacons. Deacons are called to be holy, inasmuch as they are dispensers of Christ's mysteries and servants of the church. So it turns out that the deacons are imaging another aspect of Christ. The bishop are imaging Christ the high priest. The priests are imaging Christ the mediator. The deacons are imaging Christ the servant. Right? So it says they should keep themselves free from every vice. Why? Because those vices are going to get in the way of them being servants. Right? Because a vice will become a slave master. And you'll be serving the slave master. So you should strive as a deacon to keep yourself from every vice, so that you can answer to one master and one master alone, Jesus. And we're going back to being freed from the attachment to riches, that would be poverty. Being freed from the attachment to lust, that would be chastity. Being freed from attachment to ego, that would be obedience. Right? So, and the deacons are to stand before all as personification of goodness and friends of God. There's something about the deacon that's supposed to image the goodness of God. That's why he's called in a special way to a charitable ministry, right? So that people go, the good deacon, he's really good, right? I can see what he's doing there. You know, I appreciate the goodness and the generosity. And I appreciate that he's a friend He's a friend of God. I can tell by his prayer life, right? And let's just remind ourselves that every priest needs to be a deacon first, and doesn't cease to be a deacon when he becomes a priest. So a priest is a friend of God, a personification of goodness, an image of Christ the servant, before he becomes an image of Christ the mediator. Because Christ came not to serve, not to be served, but to serve. Right? And then it says, well, what about the seminarians? And the council calls them clerics, because back then, immediately when they entered the seminary, seminarians would basically have the tonsure back in the early 1960s. And from that point on, that they got the tonsure, like the shaving of their hair, like I've got a natural hole on top of my head there. But for some, you gotta just get it shaved. So, but the point is, the tonsure was like the sign that you had become a cleric. Now, after the reform of St. Paul VI, you only become a cleric when you ordain a deacon. But at the time of the council, at the time of Lumen Gentium, the clerics were including the seminarians. And so in the context of this paragraph, it's talking about seminarians, right? So they, meaning the seminarians, will accomplish this becoming holy. Oh wow, I thought they just had to wait until they become deacon and then they become holy. I thought that they could basically live the wild life until they become ordained as a priest. No, that's not it, right? They need to accomplish already this pursuit of holiness by their constancy in prayer. You got to learn habits of constant prayer in the seminary. By their burning love, and by their unremitting recollection of whatever is true, just, and of good repute. What's the unremitting recollection? That means they have to keep thinking about these things. The true, the just, the good, right? They have to strive to basically have their mind reshaped, not according to the culture, but according to Christ, right? So that they can become an image of Christ once they are ordained. And they will accomplish all of this so that they can get a really big parish. No, that's not what the council says. They will accomplish this so that they can get a really high position with lots of prestige. No, that's not what the council says either. They will accomplish all of this, the council says, for the glory and honor of God. Now we go into the religious state. So Lumen Gentium 43. The religious state is not an intermediate state between the clerical and lay state, right? Just like purgatory is not a middle point between heaven and hell, so that you could go either way if you're there. No. As a matter of fact, purgatory is the antechamber of heaven, so it's not a middle thing, right? But in some same way, the religious state is not in between the clerical state for the ordained and the lay state for the non-ordained. The council says specifically, but rather the faithful of Christ who are called by God to that religious state are coming from both the lay state and the clerical state. In other words, they could be called to pursue in a radical way the observance of the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience as deacons, as priests, and also as lay people. Right? So in other words, they don't cease to be lay if they embrace the evangelical counsels. If they don't cease to be ordained if they embrace the evangelical counsels. Do you understand? It's colors how they're going to live their lay state or how they're going to live their clerical state. Is that clear the way I explained it? Okay. And so they are called by God from both the clerical state or the lay state so that they might enjoy this particular gift in the life of the church. So it turns out that the religious state is a particular gift in the life of the church. And thus each in one's own way. Again, there's a diversity of how it's going to be lived out there. Maybe of some advantage to the salvific mission of the church. So the mission that the church has received from Christ to be pursuing the lost, to save them and bring them to Jesus, that particular gift of imitating the poor Christ, the chaste Christ, the obedient Christ, that's supposed to be of some advantage to win the lost. Right? So, how's that? We're going to see that in a moment. Lumen Gentium 44. The people of God have no lasting city here below. In other words, this may be the town where we live right now, but this is not the eternal city. Right? We have no lasting city. This residence in which we live, this town that we call our town right now, is only our town for now. We're passing as pilgrims in this world. And we, the people of God, look forward to one that is to come, to the lasting city that is to come. So they are basically living in this world, but not as if this world was it. So they're not of this world. Since this is so, the religious state, whose purpose is, now what's the purpose? We're about to say it now. What's the purpose of the religious state? To free its members from earthly cares. That's the purpose of the religious state. That those who are called to it are invited in order to give the witness that they're supposed to give. They're being gifted with freedom from earthly cares. And how are they going to live this out? Well, they're going to live this out by sharing goods in common, right? They're going to do that by practicing a universal fraternity. They're going to do that by not actually listening to their ego, but following the will of their superior. Right? So, and that's going to free them from earthly cares, which is, who's in charge here? Oh, I know. It's the superior of the congregation. Where am I supposed to be right now? What does the rule of life say? Well, you're supposed to be at lunch right now. Okay, but where are you? You're supposed to be in the chapel right now. Well, where are you? Right? So you don't have to worry. What am I going to wear today? That's an earthly care. The religious says, I don't have to worry about that. I got to put my makeup on. I don't have to worry about that. Another earthly care that's out of the way. Right? So, oh, what about my shoes? The congregation is providing for my shoes. What about my food? The congregation is providing for my food, right? Earthly care is basically, I'm freed from that. I might be doing the shopping on behalf of the community, but that, I don't have to shoulder that all on my own, right? There's a communal thing here. And why is it important? The purpose is to free its member from earthly care. Because if this is so, they will more fully manifest to all believers. It's not just for them. It's for all believers in Christ, the presence of heavenly goods already possessed here below. In other words, what's going to be heaven like? Well, in heaven, we're all going to be poor. Did you know that? Because none of us are going to have private property in heaven, right? Nobody's going to have condos in heaven, right? You're not going to get your private space. There's no such thing in heaven, right? So, in heaven, everybody's going to be in charge, right? We say that when someone dies and they were bossy in life, they're going to give God a run for his money. I don't think so. The only place they would do that is in hell. So that's the thing, right? Heaven is not a place where anybody's got egos. So everybody's obedient to God. Is anybody having sex in heaven? No. Everybody's practicing a chastity. Why? Because this sexuality, as beautiful and holy as it is for this world, not for heaven. Right? So those who are abstaining from the beautiful and holy, sacred sexuality are not doing so because it's bad. They're doing so to image heaven, where it's not a thing. Right? So Christ proposed to his disciples this form of life, which he, as the Son of God, accepted in entering this world to do the will of the Father. So Jesus went there first, right? He chose a life of poverty. Imagine, you're God, you've got everything, right? Why wouldn't you be born in a palace? Well, that's not what he chose. He chose to be born in Bethlehem, in a manger. He chose to have parents in Nazareth, a very poor village, where the animals were inside the house, not outside in a fence. He chose to basically live a chaste life. He never married, never dated, never had sex. And he chose to listen to his Father every day of his human life while on earth, taking his cues from the Lord as where he was going to go today. Thus, the state which is constituted by the profession of the evangelical councils, so that's the religious state, you profess poverty, chastity, and obedience by vow, that's what that's saying, though it is not a hierarchical structure of the church. In other words, the church doesn't need that for its order. Nevertheless, it undeniably belongs to the life of the church and to the holiness of the church. We would be missing something fundamental should it not be there. This is a precious gift, the Council tells us in Lumen Gentium 42, of divine grace given by the Father to certain souls. You know, when parents have children called to the religious state, they often have like a pinch in their heart. Oh, was looking forward to grandchildren. Oh, look at them. They're going to wall themselves up in a cloistered convent. What a waste. He was so handsome. She was so pretty. What a waste. It's not a waste. It's a sacrifice of what is good, true, and beautiful to the one who is good, true, and beautiful in its perfect form. Right? So, and this gift of divine grace given to certain souls by the Father in heaven leads them to devote themselves to God alone the more easily due to an undivided heart. They don't have to worry about who to please on any given day. And of course, that is part of the married state. If you're not actually in the business of trying to please your spouse at any point in time, but the only thing that you're concerned about is that your spouse pleases you, that might be a problem in the marriage. Right? So it's a mutual pleasing, right? It's a mutual sacrifice. This perfect continency that the religious state has, out of desire for the kingdom of heaven, has always been held in particular honor in the church. And right from the get-go, there were virgins that were consecrated celibate. Right from the get-go. Some of the apostles were called to consecrated celibacy among the 12, right from the get-go. Some were called to the married state from the get-go, like Peter, right? So, and some were consecrated to the celibate state from the beginning, like John, for example, right? So, the reason for this was and is that perfect continency for the love of God. So perfect chastity, perfect abstinence from the love of God is an incentive to charity. Oh, I thought that if I wasn't going to have sex, I was going to be a suppressed individual. That's not what it says. No. Perfect abstinence, which is ever perfect. You're ever being perfected here, being ever purified. It's not something that you achieve in its purest form from the first moment. But the thing is that it's an incentive to charity. Because you're not devoted exclusively to your spouse, you are incentivized to make every man, woman, and child someone whom you will love as if they were your kin. That's quite the challenge, because it's hard enough to treat kin with blood, to treat as kin the people of your own blood, but to treat perfect strangers as if they were your family, that is another challenge, right? So, and it's certainly a spiritual source of fecundity in the world. So I thought that if the religious are not married and are not having kids, like, that makes them sterile and barren. Well, no, it does not. Because it's a source of spiritual fecundity in the world. And the same spiritual source of fecundity in the world would be true of a couple who, through an experience of sterility, is unable to conceive. they too would be called to be a spiritual source of fecundity in the world. And you might see it in the way that they give themselves, they pour themselves out for others, right? Not because they didn't want to have kids, but because they weren't given any. And so the profession of the evangelical councils, profession of the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, as an attractive sign for all the members of the church, it's a sign which can and ought to attract all the members of the church. Notice that the religious are not meant to do this so that you can watch them and say, well, it's nice. Thank God it's not me. Right? It's a sign that can and ought to attract all the members of the church to an effective and prompt fulfillment of the duties of their Christian vocation. So you watch sister, you watch father, and you watch the way that they give themselves, and you go, do I do that at home? Do I do that in the world in my profession? I watch them serve. You know, how am I serving? In other words, we're mutually speaking to each other the language of love. The priest looks at the married couple and says, come on, get off your behind, right? Like, look at the married couples out there raising kids and not sleeping when they're having young kids at home. You can do this. One more mass. Go for it, right? Not hard, right? So like, you can work hard. You could have had 5 kids. So it's not the life of a bachelor, right? So it's not that. It's not the life of a spinster, right? No. And in the opposite side, from the opposite angle, the married couples can watch the priest and say, there's some selflessness in there. There's a sense of sacrifice in there. Maybe I'm growing resentful these days. Maybe I ought to basically be more generous, right? Generous with my time, generous with my money, generous with my talents, generous with my self-gift. I'm supposed to become holy. What? No, I thought that was for just the other people. No, the universal call to holiness, right? I'm called to be holy. You're called to be holy. Everyone is called to be holy. Furthermore, the religious state not only witnesses the fact of a new and eternal life acquired by the redemption of Christ. So the life that we receive in baptism through Jesus' death and resurrection, it foretells the future resurrection of Jesus and the glory of the heavenly kingdom. So every time that the religious state, you see a member living out their religious vocation, you see the resurrection triumphing, breaking out into the world, the new life of Jesus Christ seeping into the world, transforming the world, making what is old new. The importance of the profession of the evangelical council, the importance of the vows is seen in the fact that it fosters the perfection of the love of God and love of neighbor. You're not called to love less when you're religious. You're called to love more in an outstanding manner. So there's a way in which you are becoming a role model for all the believers. So you're free from earthly care so that you can really be a model for all believers. You understand that? If you had to strive for survival every day, you wouldn't have the wherewithal to be able to be a role model at all, right? But in the relief from earthly cares, you can focus on loving your God with an undivided heart and loving your neighbor radically speaking. And that this profession of the councils of poverty, chastity, and obedience is strengthened by the fact that they are vows. It's just not a nice way to live. It's your commitment. It's your marital commitment as a consecrated celibate. Indeed, the councils, Lumen Gentium 46, all should take note that professing the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience is most beneficial to the development of the human person. Turns out you become a better human if you try to live out those counsels. Who knew? Indeed, the councils voluntarily undertaken according to each one's personal vocation. So you can live a form of poverty as a married person. It won't be the same poverty. If you have no savings, it's probably not good. Right? But the fact of the matter is, and if the priest or the nun is trying to keep up with the fashion of the times, that's not good either. Right? So the councils voluntarily undertaking according to each one's personal vocation contribute to the purification of heart and spiritual liberty. This is all meant to help us become pure of heart, single focus on what matters, calling the essential essential and the secondary secondary, being able to see people not just as a means to an end, but as an end in of themselves, because they were created in the image and likeness of God. Contribute to spiritual liberty, that you will be less attached to the goods of this world, less attached to your sexual desires, less attached to your ego as you learn to practice those vows in the way that it's there. And it's not different for the married state, because if you live natural family planning in the married state, you're definitely going to be living moments of chastity in your life. Every month, for all the fertile time, there's going to be a decision to either avoid or pursue pregnancy. So that's just going to be a sacrifice and a half. Right? So that's not going to be like, no, that's what the church called conjugal chastity. Right? So chastity means integration, right? Sexual integration according to God, not according to the culture. They continually stir up the vows, the fervor of charity. You become burning with love. But especially the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience are able to more fully mold the Christian man, the Christian woman, to that type of chaste and detached life which Christ the Lord chose for himself, and which his mother also embraced. I mean, we don't call her the Virgin Mary for nothing. Right? So, in her marital state, I don't know if you realize that, but she embraces both, right? She's the only one. She's the only one that embraces, as a pure human, the consecrated state, the consecrated celibacy in her virginity, and the marital state in her marriage to Joseph. That's unique, but that's basically a way for God to say, it's supposed to work together. The rest of you are going to be living one or the other, but you're supposed to work together just like it comes harmoniously together in the Virgin Mary. Do you see how she's an image of the church? So brothers and sisters who in monasteries or in schools or hospitals or in the missions adorn the bride of Christ by their unswerving and humble faithfulness in their chosen consecration, and render generous services of all kinds to mankind. And so the church is basically saying here that those monks, those nuns, those religious brothers and sisters, they are images of the bride responding to the groom being Jesus. They are examples of the church as bride, and they strive to be faithful in an unswerving. That means they are not dodging this faithfulness. They're not giving themselves breaks or vacation from that faithfulness. And they assume that chosen consecration, and in the process of all that, they render generous services of all kinds to humanity. Let each of the faithful called to the profession of the evangelical councils persevere and ever grow in that vocation. Lumen Gentium 47. Let each of the faithful carefully see to it that he or she persevere and ever grow in that vocation. God has given that religious. Let that religious do this for the increased holiness of the church, for the greater glory of the one and undivided Trinity, which in and through Christ is the fountain, the source of all holiness. Let them, Jesus has given them a specific calling. They are to live it out so that the whole church may become more holy. Think about Mother Teresa. How many people have been inspired to love better because of Saint Mother Teresa? That's what that means. The whole world became holier through her single witness. And then finally, in that section, it tells us that it is the duty of the ecclesiastical hierarchy to regulate the practice of the evangelical councils by law. Since it is the duty of the same hierarchy to care for the people of God and to lead them to most fruitful pastures. So the bishops in their dioceses are to regulate those who are pursuing the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience in a certain way, according to a certain spirituality, imaging a certain aspect of Christ, that's the charism, and pursuing a particular mission, that's called the apostolic. So they are to monitor this, supervise this, accompany this, regulate this. Why? Because we live in a sinful world, and disorder could creep into those forms of life. And so the bishop is to accompany them so that they are lifting up people and not bringing them down. So that there's actually order in that community and not disorder. So that there's beauty in that community and not chaos. So that there's virtue in that community and not vice. And if there's something flawed about how the community is organized in its leadership, or something is twisted in their spirituality, the bishop is to correct it. And then it says here, the hierarchy following with docility the prompting of the Holy Spirit, accept the rules presented by outstanding men and women that would be the founders of those religious congregations, and authentically approves these rules after further adjustments. And so it's important here to note, to basically do a little bit of a tour of the garden of that religious state, that we're talking about those who live various forms of religious life. So let's just list them for a moment. The order of consecrated virgins, right? So that's the most ancient order in the church, meaning women who would be living in the world and who would consecrate their virginity in a ceremony that would be presided by the bishop, and would earn a living, would earn their keep, and would have a rule of life in the home where they live alone, and they would have a specific apostolate, a specific mission that they would be discerning with the bishop. So in our days, there's been a revival of that, and I personally got to see one such young woman in the cathedral in Ottawa a year ago, right? Tabitha. And and she's not the only one, there's others. There's Dr. Holly in Kingston, for example, and there's been others as well, right? So it's a beautiful thing. So that's one form of professing the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Another form would be those who are called religious sisters and religious brothers, right? Typically, there will be a community of women, or there will be a community of men. For example, the Queenship of Mary's Sisters, or the Servants of the Cross, for example, or the Congregation of Notre Dame Sisters, or the Sisters of Providence, the Sister of Charity, what we call the Grey Nuns, right? So those are congregations of women. Congregations of men, religious brothers. For example, the Franciscans would basically be among them, because among the Franciscans, they're not all priests, right? They're friars, right? So the Dominicans have friars as well. Not all of them are priests, right? So congregations of brothers, there'd be like there's been a number of teaching congregations. For example, the Marian community, the Marianist, or there's been various forms. Like I was taught in grade 5 by a brother who is a Marianist, right? So So there would be like different ones, the missionaries of the Sacred Heart. That would be another congregation of brothers, right? So some of them would be priests, but they wouldn't all be priests. And so congregation, then there would those congregations that I'm describing, in of themselves, they are not cloistered. That's what makes them religious sisters and brothers. They would pursue typically a more apostolic mission. So they would basically have a mission, whether it's in healthcare, or in education, or in evangelization, or with the poor, right? So they would have a particular focus. And so, and then there would be the contemplative ones that would be cloistered. So that would be, for example, the monks and the nuns. Whether they be Benedictines, Cistercians, Trappists, right? So those would be monks or nuns, right? So Carmelites. There's an order of Carmelite sisters that is apostolic, and they would be like religious sisters. And there's an order of Carmelites that is cloistered. They would be nuns, right? So, and then you would have hermits. Hermits living alone in little log cabins outside of monasteries, but on the same property as the monastery. Those would be one form of hermits. There would be hermits living communally, but each one would have a cell that they would be living in, and the food would basically be passed through them, through like in their cell directly. They wouldn't be eating in a refectory. They would sort of like almost like be walled up in their cell. They would come to the chapel for the main offices, and then once a week they would actually be going on a hike together, and they would be able to talk on Sunday. But the rest of the time they would be in complete silence other than the time that they do liturgical prayer. That's called the Carthusians. That's the order of Saint Bruno, right? And I'm describing here mostly the Latin Rite. There's obviously other forms of religious life in the Eastern rites. And so like in their own monasteries, for example, it tends to be more the monastic state. There's less diversity of religious state than in the Latin Rite, but there is definitely religious in the Eastern rites of the Catholic Church. And so then you would have also the secular institutes. So for example, those would be lay people that would essentially profess the evangelical councils, would agree to give 10% of their income to the religious institute, the secular institute. They would be living in the world, and they would have a mission that they would come together for retreats, and they would pursue a particular apostolate while each remaining in the world. And for the most part, they wouldn't have a communal life. But some might be called for the service of the institute to live a communal life. And then you would have another group of people, which would be like the newest forms of consecrated life. So here, for example, we've welcomed the Mary Bethlehem family. So there would be a newer form of consecrated life that is still accompanied by the church and is not yet approved in its final state. Right? So religious communities that are made of sisters and brothers, but they're not separate. They're living on different floors. There's some aspect of their life that's separated from each other. There's some aspect of their life, for example, in prayer and meals that is together. So that those forms are typically, it's like calling about the co-ed, like when we talk about this for schooling. It's like a co-ed religious life that images the family by having men and women in the same community. That form of life has been time-tested over the centuries, and it needs to constantly be accompanied by the church, because there's a peril in it that needs to be more closely monitored. There's also a joy and a beautiful gift in it, but it needs to be more accompanied by the church. So if you understand that such a community is allowed to live and is allowed to be accompanied, like it takes time, right? For example, you think about the poor Clares. Saint Clare lived most of her life as a poor Clare without a rule formally approved by the church By the time that the church formally approved that rule that she was living her life with, along with her cloistered sisters, or cloistered nuns in this case, she was almost at the end of her life. Right? Where St. Francis got his rule approved much earlier, but then died not that long after. You know, so it's not uncommon to have those various forms. And then in those religious communities, both the traditional and the more recent ones, because the Holy Spirit keeps inspiring them, keep inspiring more forms of consecrated life, you've got what is called the affiliate members. So that means that lay people who are looking at this particular spirituality of a community, be it Dominican, Franciscan, Carmelite, and the rest, or the Mary Bethlehem family, for example, or the Queenship of Mary, and they surround that community with their friendship, their financial support, potentially like they share in some prayer, some retreats, some gatherings, some ongoing accompaniment. So the community could be providing them like a formation in an ongoing way. I think to a certain extent the Companions of the Cross do a little bit of that, right? They do have affiliate members, right? So, and the Companions of the Cross, for example, are an example of a society of apostolic life, which is its own category in the religious state, right? So, in this case, they are always priests. So it's really, it's quite the diversity, and thank you for paying attention to all of that, because it's quite a beautiful mosaic that is given to us to inspire us in our own state of life. And it doesn't obviously rule out, as I said, that someone who is separated, someone who is divorced, someone who is widowed, could choose consecrated celibacy in an intentional way. Someone who would be single without separation or without becoming a widow or widower, but would basically choose that form of consecration, but may not be joining an order, may not be joining a secular institute, may not be joining a monastic community, but very much lives out their consecration. They're not in between. They've chosen to live out poverty, chastity, and obedience in their state of life. The obedience is tougher to live when you don't have a formal affiliation, but you could still be discerning that, right? And sometimes you think to yourself, I've never found my home yet. And then you come to a point where maybe you're 50 and all of a sudden you just find this community and they're just a perfect fit. And you go, where have you been all my life? Well, I guess it wasn't until now, right? So the Holy Spirit has different seasons for our lives. Not all of us are called to be affiliated with a religious congregation from the get-go, and not all of us are mandated to do so, but it can be a beautiful way for us to be striving, to be pursuing that call to holiness. So for myself, as a diocesan priest, for example, I'm affiliated with the Mary Bethlehem family, so I'm an oblate of Miriam. So that means I'm totally a diocesan priest 100%. But privately, by vows, I'm also an oblate. And I renew that commitment by vows once a year. And that has to be with my bishop's approval. And so that's why, by the way, you see me wear a ring. Not just a fancy thing, it's because those are my vows as an oblate. Typically, a diocesan priest doesn't wear a ring, because the bishop wears the ring for all the priests. Again, you need the permission of the bishop to do that. Unless it's a university ring, then it's a different story. And so we thank the Lord for all of this, and we give him thanks by saying, glory be to the Father, and to the Son, the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Next week, we'll be looking at potential salvation and necessary evangelization. That'll be the focus of next week, as long with a recalling of the laity as agents of sanctification in the world.